So guys, I'll give a very short intro of Kaustabh. So Kaustabh is a accomplished leader who had played key roles and led large teams in mostly consumer tech companies and the couple of companies which are very popular. Almost all of us would have experienced at least once our urban ladder in Dunzo, right? So, and Kaustabh is also an angel investor and advises early stage founders think through their business models, operating strategies. He's also an advisor with Antler. Antler is a small early stage VC firm, not small, early stage VC firm. So he's also a portfolio advisor there. Kaustabh had actually built several high performing teams, mentored them to accomplish their goals, right? What I've learned, so I think last week I happened to befriend Kaustabh and then know him little more about his personal life. So he's also an avid book reader and enjoys his free time with his 6-year-old son. So guys, I'll give a very short intro of Kaustabh. So Kaustabh is a accomplished leader who had played key roles and led large teams in mostly consumer tech companies and the couple of companies which are very popular. Almost all of us would have experienced at least once our urban ladder in Dunzo, right? So, and Kaustabh is also an angel investor and advises early stage founders think through their business models, operating strategies. He's also an advisor with Antler. Antler is a small early stage VC firm, not small, early stage VC firm. So he's also a portfolio advisor there. Kaustabh had actually built several high performing teams, mentored them to accomplish their goals, right? What I've learned, so I think last week I happened to befriend Kaustabh and then know him little more about his personal life. So he's also an avid book reader and enjoys his free time with his 6-year-old son. I'd like to hear from you about your urban ladder story. So how did that happen? And then so any interesting things that we can know from that journey.
Absolutely. First of all, Rafi and Sharanya, thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to talk to all of you. Thanks for this audience. As far as thanks for all the high praise. I don't think I fully deserve them, but nonetheless. So Urban Ladder was serendipitous. So I started my career with IBM. Right? I was a functional consultant there. Did a bunch of SAP implementations. Right? I was a techno-functional consultant. After about 3 odd years, I figured I'm understanding processes and stuff, but I'm not really getting to understand how companies strategize. And that's when I thought moving into a corporate finance kind of a role and working closely with the senior management in IBM would help. That's when I moved to Bangalore in the corporate finance team within IBM. Did a bunch of Excels and PPTs. I realized after a couple of years that Excels and PPT is enough. I now wanted to get my hands dirty, really wanted to get out there and do some things rather than just coloring cells. So that's when I joined a furniture manufacturing company here in Bangalore. Very, very small unit run by a couple of NID designers called Quetzal, now called Total Environment Woodworks. So I spent about 1 year working with them. It was a company which used to make furniture for 5-star hotels and real estate projects, mostly for total environment building systems. So in case any of you have a property there, or if you know your friends, colleagues having properties there, most of the woodwork that ends up inside a total environment house comes from this factory that I was part of. Right there, it was a 1 year stint, but that 1 year was like super eye-opening for me, right? And I was 28 at the time, right? It opened my eyes to business with, in a way which I don't think any other experience was able to do for me eventually, right? It told me 2 or 3 key things. One, respect and dignity for people is super important, right? I used to head everything there other than product design. So we had a factory of about 150, 200 odd workers, people, and procurement team, finance team, HR team. So all of these functions used to work with me. So the key insight there, right, is and I knew all those 150 workers by name, right? And I knew bit about their families, the struggles that they would go through, and the tribulations that they would have at every point of time. They used to keep coming back and sharing. It was super important for me and the relationship that I built with each of those folks, right? Because being a small manufacturing setup in India is tough, right? You have more downs than ups, and during those downs, it are these folks who really hold the ship tight, right? They are the ones who will continue to keep working on the shop floor, ensuring that production is happening, ensuring that products are leaving the factory on time, so that customers can pay us, and then we can pay salaries and stuff like that. And because it's a small entity, the cash loop is very, very small, right? So that was one key learning. The second key learning, which pretty much told me that what I learned during my MBA days was not really all that useful, is that cash is super important. If you don't have cash in a business, nothing else matters. Whatever the P&L might look like, and whatever else might be the forward-looking stories that you might have, it just does not matter if you don't have cash, right? So, being armed with those two learnings, I was like, okay, good. Now what to do with those learnings? Serendipitously, ended up meeting the co-founders of Urban Ladder. They were still ideating on what Urban Ladder should be, right? They were still at the phase of, they were clear that they wanted to do something online. They were still trying to decide whether it was actually furniture or something else, right? Conversations with me gave them the confidence that furniture was something that is possible. And if I joined the team, it would give them the adequate experience in furniture, because both of them came from very different backgrounds. One was an ex-McKinsey consultant. The other used to work with Yahoo and Cognizant before that. So he was a techie McKinsey guy. After that, he was selling books. So furniture was not something that either of them had done, right? So I was the only one who came in with that expertise and exposure to furniture manufacturing and furniture logistics in general, right? So I happened to join them. I really liked them. I joined them around 2012 April. We eventually launched our website July of 2012. Right. My initial mandate was setting up the operations for Urban Ladder. Right. And we started off working with the logistics companies at that point of time, and it was Blue Darts of the world who were the Blue Dart and Gatis, who were really big. Ecom Express and the current 3PL giants, Ecom Express Delivery, were still not founded, right? So yeah, I know I sound old, but those were the days. Very quickly, we realized that working with logistics companies was not going to cut it for us, because we were really hell-bent on providing a superlative customer experience. What that really threw at us was a significant challenge and an opportunity to really set benchmarks for the country. And that, when I look back, was a key turning point for me and my career eventually, right? Because we looked at it as a problem that was not solved in the country, and when we looked globally, we figured it was not yet entirely solved globally as well. And we were not just solving furniture logistics for going from city 1 to city 2, but also doing the last mile deliveries and the installation and all of that in a very, very seamless manner for the customer. And in case any of you have purchased from Urban Ladder, you might have experienced a part of it, right? For us to develop that from scratch, right, and keep evolving on that journey as we continue to scale was a thrill in its own, right? Our NPS, when we started measuring it in 2012 itself, after about 3 months of launching, we started off at an NPS about 85. By the time I left in 2019, which was 7 years later, we were present in about 50. Actually, we scaled to 100 cities, then we scaled it back to 50 cities. We were still operating in about 50 cities. Our NPS continued to be in the 70s, right? So for what it's worth, with the growth, we were able to ensure that our customer experience did not go for a toss, right? Be it on product quality, be it on service delivery, or whatever. It's across the board, right? And I think for today's conversation, I might be able to pick up quite a few learnings from that period of how process and process excellence play a significant role in ensuring that the customer outcomes don't get compromised as you keep scaling, right? Because as you keep scaling, you will realize that the number of variables at play keep increasing, right? And the primary objective of any process, right, is to ensure that you keep reducing the number of unpredictable variables in the equation and and ensuring that the system continues to become as predictable as possible, right? And that's what I think I was able to achieve with the brilliant team that I had. I was fortunate to lead. It was great. So 2019 is when I decided to part ways with Urban Ladder, and after that did a couple of short stints at RGO and then at Lucas, and then I finally landed up at Dunzo, where I again spent a year and a half heading their business operations. And Dunzo, incidentally, I joined during COVID and quit during the next wave of COVID. So saw one wave, then the next wave. I did not ever meet the team face to face ever. The only times I met the team face to face was between the second wave and the third wave, which is after I had left Dunzo, right? So most of the parties that I have had with my Dunzo folks have been after I've left Dunzo. So that's a good part. but yeah, so that's been my journey at Urban.
If you have one productivity hack, that always worked for you, just wanted to hear from that.
Sure. So one hack that I've developed over a period of time, and it is still work in progress for me, is actually I'll talk of two. One is where you're able to plan for the week before you get into the week, right? It really helps. And when you say plan, it is when I say plan, it is not just about saying that what I want to accomplish through the week. It's also about saying what are the meetings I want to attend, which are the meetings I don't want to attend. And which brings me to my second hack, which is to say that I firmly believe that meetings are not necessarily supposed to be update calls. If there is a problem to be solved, if there's a decision to be made, then I would rather be in the call. If there's an update to be given, then I'm okay for updates to happen over unsynchronous ways. It could be asynchronous ways, could be over Slack, could be over email, and I'm totally fine with that, right? So meetings have to potentially be, because they are expensive more often than not, right? And if it means that I am in a meeting, then it would generally mean it will be an expensive meeting because of the other folks who will be involved in the meeting. So want to make the most of a conversation. So I like to prepare for a meeting as well, to ensure that I'm in my head clear what I want out of that meeting, right? And I think these two hacks work well for me, right? Of one, preparing for the week and saying what is it that I want to accomplish for the week, and second is preparing for the meeting, at least mentally, to know what I want to derive out of a meeting if I'm having it.
I just want to hear from you in simple words, if people were to really take away what is process excellence according to you. Just wanted to hear from you. Yeah.
Sure. For me, when I think of processes and then process excellence, right, and it's important that all of us understand it that way, is what processes are supposed to achieve is that they are supposed to bring in a sense of predictability, a sense of reliability, repeatability for achieving an outcome, right? And each of these three elements, which is predictability, reliability, and repeatability, are important for an organization to know that given certain tasks or given certain goals, if we do X number of tasks, it will happen, right? And being able to build that predictability into business is important because the external circumstances are unpredictable. You can't control for everything. There will be a lot of things that will keep happening which are external to your system, and that you will anyways have to take control or respond to. To be able to respond to that effectively, you need to ensure that whatever is in your control is as predictable as possible, so that you don't have to spend cognitive load in resolving those on a day-to-day basis, right? The analogy that I give myself, and as I've seen, for example, as I've seen my son grow up, right? And there is an evolutionary history, there's an evolutionary significance to this. When a child is growing up, right, he or she learns to walk at some point of time. The first few times they're really learning to walk, right? And that is when you can see that they're focused on figuring out how to keep that one foot ahead of the next and balancing their body and figuring out how to walk. The moment they figure that out, it goes from their cognitive mind to their unconscious or the subconscious mind, and the body takes over at that point of time. That is really what is process building, right? Once the process is set, it becomes automated. You move on to the next thing, which is for a child to now learn to run, or to learn to climb, right? And that is how I see us also, and that is in the context of organizations. As organizations keep growing, right? If you have to grow, and if you have to grow effectively and efficiently, you need to have processes in place which allow you to keep automating decision, if not the process itself, right? And that is super important for organizations, because it does two things, right? Once it becomes automated, right, at least you have to think of evolutionary biology. Why is it important for a process or a decision to move from the cognitive part of the brain to the subconscious? It's important because the subconscious mind takes much lesser energy, right? And there is only so much energy that your body can expend in a given day, right? And if that is going to be spent on mundane repetitive tasks, then your body or your mind will not be able to move ahead, right? You have to think of processes in the organizational context in the same way, is the way I see it.
Wonderful. So does process excellence has any role in the startup ecosystem, or is it relevant only for certain setups like large enterprises or some of the different types of industries? Sure. So what's your take on that?
Yeah. So the way I see it is, it's not so much a stage of a company which determines whether processes are relevant or not. Even in a large organization, if the team is solving an unknown problem, then processes will come in the way of it, right? What is really important is to understand whether the problem definition itself is unknown, or the solution set is unknown, or have both of them gotten solved. Okay, because at that point of time it really moves to execution, because then you know what the answer is. You just have to do it better and better and keep doing it again and again, right? Maybe the scope and the span will keep increasing. If the problem definition is unknown, and if the solution set hence is unknown, you can't have too many processes governing that, right? At that point of time, you really want to figure out what is it that you're trying to figure, right? Once, let's say you've defined the problem now, and solution set still continues to be unknown, there is not too many processes that you can put in place you don't have a process, or you don't know what the steps are to even processize it. So you can leave out the process at that point of time. Once you have defined your solution set is when you really start to then talk about putting in place processes, so that there is a certain amount of repeatability that you can start, or reliability that you can start bringing into the outcomes. Because that's when you want to see if doing the same thing again and again, whether it was with one client or whether it was with 20 clients, does it still yield the same results? And that's when you start to really take it back. And I think one of the critical aspects of process excellence is not just about having processes in place on day one and keeping them static, but the feedback loop of saying that these processes are going to undergo a continuous improvement cycles, right? And that is key, because that allows for the organization and the organizational processes to respond to external stimulus, right? And that really ensures that the processes don't become outdated or become a burden on what the team really is doing at that point of time to achieve their goals, right? So that is really how I see when processes become relevant for an organization in their journey.
I just wanted to understand how does process excellence play a role in our industry or in our domain? Would you be able to show throw some light on these functions, especially in our industry?
Sure. So one thing that I missed talking about earlier when we spoke about process excellence is the importance of goals, right? And how goals link back and ensure that processes succeed, right? What's important, and a clear distinction to be made, and this is where I think it becomes more relevant for the technology teams, is measures not getting mistaken for goals, right? Productivity measures are measures, not necessarily goals. The goals will always remain the business outcomes, right? And being able to clearly distinguish between the two is super important, because more often than not, once, and there are quite a few memes that I've seen of this. Once the measure becomes the goal, then organizations and processes lose the plot, right? Then it starts to resemble bureaucracy. And I think more often than not, when we talk of processes, we imagine bureaucracy, and that is what you want to stay away from. If processes can remain fresh, right? If processes remain fresh, it is expected to enable you in your decision making, right? So if your role involves any kind of decision making, the decision making framework, the decision making governance mechanisms of saying that, what, should I consider this a bug or should I consider this a new feature request, right? Those are things that you would process through a governance mechanism of saying, how do you want to treat it? And those governance mechanisms actually resemble your processes. That is supposed to help the software development team from really taking on work which they could have said no to, but have no way to say no, right? Just as an example. So the moment those governance mechanisms are put in place, right, it saves the most critical resource available to the organization in your case, which are your software development teams, from doing work which is non-value added, or rather has incrementally lesser value than actually really working on a new feature which potentially has a business outcome associated with it or a client request associated with it, which can really move the needle for the organization at large, right? That's where governance mechanisms comes in. The other part around measures becoming goals, and I've seen that happen in at least a couple of my past organizations. For example, I've been part of discussions where we used to debate on whether lines of code written should it be a goal for every engineer, right? Or the number of story points shipped in a quarter, should they be part of the performance criteria for an engineer, right? And I've never seen any team come to a consensus on that, but at least my takeaway has been that that in itself can't be the goal for an engineering team, right? What really is the engineer developing is a feature set or a product or a part of the product which is finally going to impact a client, right? As long as the engineering and the technology team, if the engineering and the technology team are shy or are away from what is the client impact, then no matter of what processes we set in place, they will never tie back into saying that, what, the work that I've done is really impacting the business this way or is really impacting my organization this way. And I've seen this dissonance exist a lot, right? With the engineering teams, with delivery teams in general, to saying that, what, I'm writing code. All I get to hear is the bugs, but I don't really get to see what is the impact that potentially my code is having out there, right? And in Tanso's case, for example, right, it is a software platform at the end of the day, but whenever we've been able to send our engineers on the ground to the shops which their code impacts, or to talk to the driver partners which their codes impact, the insights that the engineers have been able to walk away with has been tremendous, right? It was no amount of mentoring can really get them to cross that chasm, right? So it's really important at any point of time that your processes and org structures ensure that your technology teams are as close to the customer as possible, wherever that's possible to be done. Because the moment that starts to happen, right, you will realize that a lot of the processes that you might have set in place become redundant, right? And that is really what you want. You want nimble organizations, you want nimble processes to exist, ensuring that the team is working on the right problems at the right time with the right motivation, right? And the right motivation, more often than not, is defined by the goal. And if the goal is really basis of measure as opposed to the outcome, then that is what they will try and optimize for.
Perfect. Thanks for your perspective, Kaustabh. I could also try to summarize this in our context that, I think adherence to process, following the structured process would definitely help our technology, engineering, and product teams in building high quality, more stable products, which eventually, take us to the, which helps us actually achieve a better customer satisfaction, right? So that's a very important message, and thanks for that. So I have another interesting question to ask. I wanted to have your perspective there. Process excellence, while it is helping every type of organization in every part of the journey, however, can you think of any areas where excessive process formulation actually causes hindrances to the growth or to the organization? So are there any scenarios that you can think of?
Oh, absolutely. As I mentioned earlier, right? If the problem space or the solution space is unknown, at that point, having a process can really kill the idea itself, right? You don't want to burden an ideation phase for any new product. For example, let's say you have 5 products and you want to launch a 6th product, right? If you were to take that product team, whoever is thinking, product or sales team or the engineering team is thinking through what that 6th product has to be, and put them through the same processes of your most mature product, the product will never see the light of day, or it will definitely not come out the way it could have potentially come out as, right? It will not maximize its potential, the idea itself, right? Those are places where I don't think it works. And hence organizations have to be very, very clear on which parts of their business they want processes to govern outcomes, and which parts of the business they want to keep processes out of the equation altogether, right? And you see this play out in large enterprises. Large enterprises typically fail to respond to the market dynamics and launch new products, be it in any domain, right? Be it the domain of, let's say, FMCG companies. I mean, you see a plethora of D2C companies that have come over the last decade or so, right? Now, with the resources available to an FMCG company, what was it that did not allow them to read the insights of what the customer wanted? It was not that they did not know what the customer wanted. It was some amount of hierarchical processes set in place or governance mechanism set in place that it did not get funded enough internally, and hence it did not see the light of the day, right? So that is where I think processes work contra to it really making sense to the organization, right? That's one. The second place where I think it starts to become a burden is when processes do not have a way of continuous improvement built into them, right? How often does an organization review the processes that exist, right? If that is not already part of your process charter or whatever your process, and I've been guilty of doing the same, right? Whenever we set in place a process, we would set in place a process basis what was the current reality and leave it at that for the next few years, right? And then we suddenly realize that the organization or some parts of the organization is imploding, or rather not delivering to what we believe is the true potential of that part of the organization, right? And once you dig deeper is when you realize, what the business realities have significantly changed from the time the process was set in place. And we did not take the time to review the process again in light of the new realities, right? And the moment we were able to redo those processes, it again, unraveled the potential of that particular team members or that particular team, right? And that is super important to be able to do. Most organizations, I think, fail to do that in a very conscious and deliberate manner, which is continuous improvement. We talk of continuous improvement, and we keep improving on the fringe of processes, but not really the core process. But there is a case to be made to look at the core processes itself every now and then and say that whether it's making sense, whether all the assumptions that had gone in at a past point of time hold true even today.
Perfect. See, I think as an organization, we certainly feel processes are extremely important for us to, move the needle from one point to another point and then achieve greater customer satisfaction and, delivery of high quality products. However, and we are very good at defining the processes also, right? So we are very good at articulating the processes, publishing them. But unfortunately, I see we at times fail in actually implementing the processes or ensuring that people actually adhere to those processes. So, what is your advice on handling these kind of situations?
This is a tough one. More often than not, we also found it difficult. But given the audience in operations or business setups, it's far easier to manage that because you can create incentive structures to ensure adherence to a process, right?
Right.
So it is far easier to make it happen in that setup. Having said that, in the kind of teams that are part of this conversation, it is generally a challenge to ensure adherence. What I think should be part of the process flow itself is to assume a certain amount of non-adherence to exist, right? The other thing potentially, and I don't know if it exists, is to figure out whether you've moved in the process journey. Have you moved from having no process to your ideal process? Or was it an iterative journey of saying that, you know what, we are at no process. Can I set in place a baseline process which is rudimentary, but at least gets people herding towards following a process? And then over a period of time, continuously keep iterate and keep making it more sophisticated along the way might be an approach worth considering, right? Because one of the few things that I've learned is when we sit down to design a process, sitting in a room, right? We define the ideal process of saying that, you know what, this is what the process is expected to achieve, okay, in a theoretical way. Okay. After that, we take it to the ground, and when the tire hits the rubber, we realize the tire bursts because, of course, people come into the picture and people behave very differently. So, what is important is to and there is a lot of literature around user-centered thinking and a bunch of that, and I'm sure a lot of you would be aware of it. If you're able to keep your users at the center of it, which is let's say, for example, your software development teams, and then define processes around them, as opposed to defining processes for your management teams, right? Perhaps the adherence to processes will potentially improve, because what you're really trying to do is ensure that the system, and here I'm defining system as your development team, right? That system has to become more effective, right? They have to become more predictable to what they're committing to, and they have to have a better way of estimating, right? Because that will lead to predictability. So those problems have to get solved not from a management perspective, but from the engineering team's perspective, and then figure out what are the kind of flexes or gives that you want to give in the process to allow for a certain level of maturity to evolve over a period of time. It's important that the processes also are responsive, right? And as we just were speaking about before we got into the Q&A, the part of the processes being responsive to external environments is super critical to ensure that processes stay relevant, right? Which would also mean then that processes have to be lightweight by its very nature. The processes can't be the kind of government processes ki was script ticket leke aao, right? It can't be that way. It has to be a world where the processes are as light as possible, so that they can be changed very, very quickly. Because one of the things that happens when the processes are very, very elaborate is the inertia to change those elaborate processes is also very, very high, right? And as a result of which, if the inertia is high, the frequency at which you look at those processes also ends up being that much longer, and hence the processes become outdated very, very quickly. So in that world, you have to be able to define processes which are light, and hence the friction to change them is that much lower, and hence you can keep optimizing for those processes very, very quickly as you keep getting feedback across your multiple stakeholders on what those changes need to be or what the process needs to be, right? So I think that's what I would suggest.
Thank you. Thanks, Kaustabh.
And one other distinction to be made, right, is to say that not all processes need to be the most flexible. You need to understand which are the processes that need to be flexible, which are the processes that have now become like a part of the foundation stone itself, right? And those don't need to get touched. And those processes need to operate as they are, because that has to become part of your auto reflexes, right? Anybody who is in the system has to automatically know that this is how the process is going to work, and it has to be second nature for them. So one of the key things, right, for us that we engineered into our processes was we gave a lot of autonomy to the last mile delivery team, okay, which meant that we did not define answers for them, right? We defined the list of questions that they needed to ask a customer to be able to arrive at their own answer. We were okay with them making judgmental errors, right? We did not castigate them on making judgmental errors. We typically held them accountable to asking the right set of questions to the customer to arrive at the answer, right? And when I say question answers, they were necessarily around products, right? Of saying that, you know what, and they needed the freedom at the customer's place to be able to take a call on whether the customer's request for a replacement product or a return is valid, and can they really accept that, right? Because that is the single largest cost hit in the last mile in terms of accepting a customer's request for a return or saying that, you know what, the product is not right, I'm not going to pay or whatever, right? Those were the questions that we needed answers to. Now, one way to do it is to, processize everything and say that, you know what, this is where you say yes, this is where you will say no, which is what you would feel like if you were to call an Airtel call center. They have a process and a policy, and every answer that you get is really backed by a policy, and hence you are like, I might as well not talk to an individual. This is something that I can get out of a chatbot, right? The process that we laid down was to ensure that the individuals had the freedom to take a call, and we empowered them with it. We held them accountable to the call, not to the call that they were making, but we held them accountable to the decision process that they were following. So as managers, if there is one process that you need to set, is this of how do you ensure that you have face time with your team members, at least every week, which is non-agenda based, right? At least if not a week, if at least a fortnightly conversation with them, which is not based on what they're working on at that point of time, but actually a non-agenda conversation to say, you know what are the challenges that you're facing. And I know it is tough, and I don't know the sizes of your teams that every manager handles, but if the span affords it, right, you should definitely try and be genuine in those conversations of wanting to solve that individual's problems. And the second thing is you have to, think of yourself as your team members' single largest cheerleader inside the company, right? If your team member knows that you have their back, that you are the single largest cheerleader at any point of time, you will be surprised at what they are willing to do for you and for the company. Once you've defined the process, right, keep the ego out of it and see if it's working or not. If it's yielding you the expected outcome, right? If it's not yielding you the expected outcome, then you need to have the humility and the curiosity to go in and say, you know what, why is it not working? Let me figure that out. Maybe my assumptions are not in place. Maybe, and the assumptions could be across the board, right? Assumptions in how the organization works, assumptions of how the team works, whatever that is. Be open to going and solving, right? And then if you're not able to, my sense is more often than not, if you're able to solve for that problem, processes start to work, right? It is, and this is something that I've always told my folks, right? Processes are only as good as the people for whom the processes are meant for. If they both work hand in hand, right? If processes don't work in isolation, so if you don't involve the people dimension when designing processes, they will anyways not. So in my example, right, when I was defining processes for carpenters, they used to be very different from the processes that we would define, for example, the city managers, because the kind of cognizance of the data and the kind of work that they would do would be very different. So I can't expect the carpenters to do the exact same, right? Which meant that the data that we were, and by the way, each one of these people used to use apps, right? We used to collect a lot of information back from our carpenters and the last moment, right? The emphasis on ensuring that the apps that were collecting the information were super easy for the carpenters to work on was very, very important. Otherwise, we would get trash data on. We would not be able to work on, right? So I think that plays a strong part in ensuring who the audience is for whom the process is being defined, and then just being open and humble about it and going and making it happen.
Perfect. Thanks a lot.